Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Stanley Leong with Susan Ng. Now, music can be consoling and soothing. Hence, in today's context, there is such a field as music therapy. In fact, according to Psychology Today, there's evidence dating back thousands of years of how music has been used therapeutically, with accounts of music therapy in Judaism and even other traditions like Hinduism. So, if music is so powerful to bring calm and healing, what sort of influence can it exert in the context of retail and consumer spending?
And this is something we'll be exploring right now on Money Mind on CNA 938. I'm Susan Ng together with Stanley Leong. Now, stay with us as we discuss the latest research on the impact of background music on consumer behavior and also spending in the F&B industry. So if you're a business owner, our guests will likely want to tell you not to let your current music play on in your retail or dining space, but to relook what you're feeding your customers through their ears, because that might well translate into higher consumer spending by them and more revenue for you.
Oh, sounds good then.
Mm.
Our guests today are Jerry Chen. He is Group CEO of UC and an acronym for Ultimate Store Experience Asia, a leader in music branding for F&B chains, retail groups, and hotels. Joining Jerry, we have Dr. Samuel Gan, who is Associate Lecturer at the James Cook University, Singapore. And he is also the main author of a recent study. The research paper is titled The Sound of Music on the Pocket, a study of background music in retail. Dr. Gan, Jerry, thank you for joining us on our program.
Thank you.
Jerry, let's start with you. I read in an interview that you'd given that the ambience of a store is important. And from your perspective, what does ambience encompass? I mean, some say it's really about how the place makes you feel based on how much pleasure or comfort each of your senses derives. How would you explain ambience?
I would term it as a form of vibe. Yes, you are right. It's about the feeling. Sometimes, you go to a place and you just say, "Hey, I like to be here." The feeling is great, but you cannot pinpoint exactly how or what actually brings you to that positive vibe. So it's a lot about vibe, a lot about how you actually experience at that moment, at that point of time.
Jerry, would you say that oftentimes there's an overemphasis on how a place looks, based on lighting and decor and furnishing, that sometimes other aspects are neglected? For example, how a store, or in this case, like a dining establishment, what it sounds like, what kind of music is being piped through, and all of those things.
I agree with you, Susan. We have a heavy emphasis in today's retail and F&B environment, putting it on visuals and visuals alone only. So when it comes to sensory environment, we are looking at the multi aspect from visuals to sound to scent, how this will be able to optimize to trigger certain type of behavior in a consumer psychology. So this is something that we study, we look into. It is more than just visual alone or looking at background music alone. It is a combination of what stimulate our different senses as a whole package. So this is what we actually look into, and there are a lot of sciences, a lot of research papers that is being poured in, and we do share that on our LinkedIn page at USEA. Global. So we actually put in a lot of scientific background research when it comes to this sensory stimulus in an environment.
And we'll definitely be making reference to a recent research also that gone into this study of where M and M meets music and money. That's going to be interesting for all our business owners out there. Now, when we talk about the power of music and its correlation with customer spend, are we more focused on its power of influence in dine-in F&B establishments? Does it also work the same way for retail department stores where people are not sitting down to eat but really walking through to shop?
It's very different context. Sometimes we just put it as very generalization, saying that background music, they know it's important, but how you use it and the strategy behind doing it is equally important. Because if you just generalize it, I'm going to play the top hits and it is good because it's familiar, it's popular, I heard it before, my consumers are okay with it. It's not just the generalization. It is how you strategically stream the right type of music to trigger different type of responses from example, what we call as perceived waiting time being shortened at a certain type of music and ambience being played out. And we look into impulsive buying. We look into upselling using voiceover, and not just any voiceover. It is a very, I would say, a voiceover that is conducive and right for the brand persona and the environment at the same time. So,
Right.
yeah.
When you say voiceover, I was suddenly thinking of Susan Ng, my dear co-host, who does a lot of voiceovers. She might be the perfect voice.
Thank you, Stanley. People always tell me they hear me in the libraries telling them to talk softer and it's time to go home.
Oh boy.
But as we continue our conversation on this topic of music and what we hear, I've heard this before. My son, sometimes he walks into a store and he goes, "Oh, this smells like America." So smell, I know we're not talking about that now, but I do understand that you need to play on all the senses when you walk into a retail store, into a dining outlet for that matter. Have you, before we talk about the research that Samuel's co-written, Jerry, have you ever walked into a store and you listen to the music, whether it's conscious or whether it's playing subconsciously in your mind, whether or not that's had an impact in your behavior as a customer? It can be positive, it can be negative. Have you had any experience like this?
Yes, in fact, when we started this business 10 years ago, I actually went to this sushi shop. It's a pretty famous one in Singapore, shan't name it. So they were actually playing Korean pop songs. So imagine having your sushi session and then listening to the K-pop song, which is pretty popular at that point of time. It was the hit back then. And it just doesn't gel down. It just doesn't have that feeling, have that vibe when you are having a Japanese meal while listening to K-pop. It just doesn't match. So that is one of the more interesting or notable experience that I had. Eventually, we converted that sushi chain into our client, and we did see a spike in revenue and sales. And when it comes to, you spoke then earlier on about fragrance. In fact, scientifically, it's been researched that if you have the right smell and music combination together, you can increase your brand recall and sales by 38%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
That's an impressive number, Stan.
Truly is. I mean, one particular mall, right? We know they were among the first to start this whole scent business, and there was, I think, Ion Orchard, right? They had pumped in a very interesting perfume there. But let's bring in Samuel into the conversation as well. Now, Samuel, you are the main author of a recent study titled "The Sound of Music on the Pocket," ka-ching, ka-ching, a study of background music in retail. So let's zoom in on this paper that you've come up with, and tell us more about what it investigates in terms of music and how it can be a tool for businesses. Give us some background as to what happened there.
So I think there's a lot of studies done overseas, but there aren't many or any that is in the same depth as our study in Singapore. And Singaporeans are unique in that sense that we have different cultural influences, we have different perspective of things as a lot of the location where the studies were done. And so what was interesting was when we tried to do the same kind of study, and we did it on a Mexican chain as well as a Japanese restaurant chain. And we did it on 3 different locations. And we had some interesting findings that gives us some trends that we need to look into. So things that many other studies have overlooked, for example, like the day, where the kind of music matching the day itself, and even matching the customer profiles that the restaurant tends to have at specific times, and even difference between weekends as well. So while we didn't find a strong effect in our study, but we found reason to look into the effect confounding variables or nuances, as we like to call it in academia, where, the day, the type of customers, and the weekend, lunch and dinner, they all have to come together. So it's not so straightforward where you do this and magically your sales will just change drastically in that sense.
Wow, so it's so granular. I mean, down to even which hour, which customer, which clientele profile set seems to be the regular customer at that time. All these have to be taken into consideration.
Yes, and there's a big difference between weekends, expectation of customers on weekends and weekdays. And for example, if a restaurant is located in an industrial area, they are going to have different people coming in on weekends or weekdays as well, and even for lunch and dinner crowds.
Right. So your selection of music's got to be. I have to tell you a little story here. Many, many, many years ago, I walked into a Korean chicken restaurant. It doesn't exist anymore in that particular mall. And they had Girls' Generation, a K-pop group, very big at that time, I think. I never knew them. But they had their music on a loop. A loop. It's the same songs on a loop. I walked out of there and I said to myself, you know what? That was a terrible lunch because I kept on hearing the same songs.
Can you sing the song back to us now, Susan?
Yeah, it was G, the G, 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 G. And it was a whole lunch I had that song.
Boy.
So,
Sorry to hear that.
yeah, so I suppose, now I know who the group is, and I must say I do enjoy K-pop music to a certain extent. So what you're saying is the day, the type of music, and don't put the same song on a loop. All that is important. But I'm sure people already sort of know that it is important to put some sound in the background. During your research, did you discover anything new? Did you maybe rediscover some old theories that were true and that people have forgotten?
I think what was interesting was that we found that a softer volume helped. And people, there was a little bit of improved sales on the conditions where we had softer volume, and this was interestingly in line with part of the COVID measures where the music was asked to be softer, right, so that people don't shout. And that could be because people, when they gather in restaurants, they want to chat with one another. And if you have even the right music, but it's too intrusive to a conversation, it might not translate to a better experience for the customers and therefore not better sales in that sense.
Right. And I know that for Jerry, your business also does, almost bespoke or tailor-made music for the different clients that you have. So I guess a lot has to be taken into consideration before you and your team compose a certain piece of music that will gel well with the concept, with the brand, and with the experience that they'd like to have for their customers, right?
Right. Given the example that was shared earlier by Susan, is that we have music that specifically chase people out on a loop. Example, every 4 songs, you put in the same song. So the perception for this reference is that, oh, I've stayed here long enough. That is a very subconscious, and you may not even notice this particular song or this particular music, but there is a lot of subconsciousness that you would be aware of in an unaware manner.
I should have left the restaurant a little bit earlier then. This is a fascinating conversation, Jerry and Samuel. I wish we could talk some more. Hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to get you back to talk to us more about this, because music and certainly fragrances are very important in the places that we go to. I know sometimes we get turned off by whatever it is that we're listening to, whatever we're seeing, and whatever we're smelling. So for sure, hopefully at some point we'll be able to pick this up. Jerry and Samuel, thank you very much for your time today.
Before we let them go, very quick, mention that they also have a talk coming up. So even though we didn't cover too much ground, there's a talk that they're organizing, organized by UC Global. And you can visit their website, UC Global, at their LinkedIn page, USEA Global. And their talk's happening on Monday, the 30th November. So do check them out if you'd like to find out more about this very spectacular and interesting topic.
Definitely very interesting. Jerry, Samuel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we were speaking with Jerry Chen, Group CEO of UC, Ultimate Store Experience Asia. They're a leader in branding, music branding for F&B chains, retail groups and hotels. And also Dr. Samuel Gan, Associate Lecturer at the James Cook University, Singapore.